Close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and let the heavy weight of the present day simply melt away into the quiet darkness. Imagine the soft, rhythmic sound of dark waters lapping gently against ancient marble stones. Feel the warm, dry breeze carrying the faint, sweet scent of lotus flowers, myrrh, and the salty mist of the Mediterranean Sea. You are no longer in the modern world. We are drifting back across the vast ocean of time, traveling more than 2,000 years into the past, to a land where gods walked among mortals, where golden sands swallowed empires, and where the greatest river on earth birthed a civilization of unimaginable wonder. This is ancient Egypt. But our story does not begin with the silent, towering pyramids or the long-forgotten pharaohs of the Old Kingdom. Instead, we are stepping into the twilight of this ancient world, a time of glittering wealth, ruthless ambition, and shifting global powers. We are here to witness the life, the mind, and the eternal legacy of the last true monarch of the Nile. A woman whose name has echoed through the corridors of history, often misunderstood, heavily mythologized, but undeniably brilliant. This is the entire true history of Cleopatra. To truly understand Cleopatra, you must first forget the Hollywood illusions. Forget the simple tales of a tragic seductress who relied merely on her beauty to manipulate the great men of Rome. The real Cleopatra was infinitely more complex, far more dangerous, and vastly more intelligent. She was a survivor, a brilliant political strategist, a naval commander, an expert linguist, and a reigning queen who held the fate of the known world in her hands. But her story begins long before her birth. The blood that flowed through Cleopatra's veins was not actually Egyptian, it was Macedonian Greek. Her lineage traced back to the jagged mountains of Macedonia and to a man named Ptolemy, one of the most trusted generals of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died suddenly in 323 BC, his massive, newly conquered empire fractured. His generals violently carved up the world among themselves, and Ptolemy claimed the richest prize of all, Egypt. Ptolemy declared himself pharaoh, establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty, a royal family that would rule from the magnificent coastal city of Alexandria for nearly 3 centuries. Alexandria was a city unlike any other in the ancient world. Founded by Alexander himself, it was a gleaming metropolis of white limestone and marble, designed to be the intellectual and cultural capital of the globe. At the entrance to its bustling harbor stood the mighty Pharos lighthouse, a soaring structure over 300 feet tall, with a fire blazing at its peak that guided merchant ships safely to shore. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Inside the city walls lay the legendary Library of Alexandria, an institution dedicated to collecting all the knowledge of humanity. It housed hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls containing the greatest works of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and literature. This was the world into which Cleopatra VII, Cleopatra, was born in the year 69 BC. Growing up in the royal palaces of Alexandria, the young princess was surrounded by staggering luxury, but also by constant, terrifying peril. The Ptolemaic family was famously wealthy, but they were equally famous for their extreme dysfunction and absolute ruthlessness. To keep their bloodline pure, they adopted the ancient Egyptian pharaonic tradition of incestuous marriages, frequently marrying their own brothers and sisters. Trust was an illusion in the royal court. Assassinations, poisonings, and violent uprisings were simply the cost of doing business. A Ptolemy was just as likely to be murdered by their own mother or sibling as by a foreign enemy. Cleopatra grew up knowing that to show weakness was to invite death. Yet, amidst the cutthroat politics of her family, she proved to be an exceptional student. She immersed herself in the vast resources of the great library. She studied mathematics, philosophy, oratory, and astronomy. But her most astonishing talent was her mastery of languages. For 300 years, the Ptolemaic rulers had lived in Egypt, collected taxes from the Egyptians, and commanded Egyptian armies, yet they rigidly refused to learn the native language. They spoke only Greek, isolating themselves from the millions of people they ruled. Cleopatra, however, was different. She possessed a rare linguistic genius and a deep understanding of political optics. She became the very first ruler of her dynasty to learn and speak the Egyptian language fluently. She could speak directly to her subjects, to the priests, and to the military without the need for an interpreter. Beyond Egyptian and her native Greek, she learned the languages of the Medes, the Parthians, the Jews, the Arabs, the Syrians, the Troglodytes, and the Ethiopians. When foreign diplomats arrived in Alexandria, they were astounded to find a teenage princess who could converse with them in their own native tongues. This intellectual brilliance was her true weapon. She realized early on that she could not rely on brute military strength alone to protect her kingdom. During Cleopatra's childhood, the world order was rapidly shifting. The golden age of the Greek empires was over. Across the Mediterranean Sea, a new, unstoppable superpower was rising, the Roman Republic. Rome was expanding its borders with terrifying efficiency, swallowing up kingdoms and turning independent nations into subjugated provinces. Egypt was the wealthiest nation on earth, acting as the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, with its massive grain harvests fueled by the annual flooding of the Nile. Rome looked at Egypt with hungry eyes. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, known mockingly as the flute player, was a weak and deeply unpopular king. To keep the Romans from invading and stripping him of his throne, he paid them colossal, crippling bribes. He borrowed massive sums of money from Roman creditors, effectively turning the independent kingdom of Egypt into a heavily indebted client state of Rome. The Egyptian people, heavily taxed and outraged by their king's groveling to a foreign power, eventually revolted. When the enraged citizens of Alexandria finally rose up in rebellion against Ptolemy XII in 58 BC, he fled the great city in terror, sailing across the sea to seek the military protection of his Roman creditors. He left behind a kingdom in absolute chaos and a family torn apart by savage ambition. While her father begged the Roman Senate for help, the power vacuum in Egypt was swiftly filled by the eldest royal women. Cleopatra's older sister, Berenice IV, boldly seized the vacant throne. But in the ruthless world of the Ptolemies, power was never secure. Berenice, a woman as cunning and dangerous as any king, had her own mother strangled to solidify her absolute rule. She married twice to strengthen her position, even ordering the murder of her first husband when he proved to be politically useless. For 3 years, Berenice ruled Alexandria with an iron fist, completely detached from the creeping shadow of Rome. During these dark and bloody years of exile, a young Cleopatra, merely a girl of 10 or 11, accompanied her disgraced father to Rome, and later to the opulent city of Ephesus in modern-day Turkey. It was during this period of displacement that the young princess received her most vital education. She observed firsthand the terrifying power, the staggering wealth, and the vicious internal politics of the Roman Republic. She learned that Rome was not a monolithic empire acting as one mind, but a brutal, chaotic arena where wildly ambitious generals and politicians constantly vied for supremacy. To survive the Romans, she realized, one had to play them against each other. She watched her father humiliate himself, borrowing even more astronomical sums of money to hire a Roman army, led by the proconsul Aulus Gabinius, to violently reclaim his stolen throne. In 55 BC, the Roman legions marched across the blistering sands of the Sinai Desert, smashing through the Egyptian defenses and laying siege to Alexandria. Ptolemy XII was restored to power, entirely propped up by foreign swords. His first act upon returning was an agonizing demonstration of Ptolemaic brutality. He ordered the immediate execution of his own daughter, Berenice IV. Cleopatra witnessed the horrific price of failure in the Game of Thrones. She saw the severed head of her older sister, a chilling reminder that in her family there was no room for mercy, only total victory or total destruction. The Roman soldiers who had restored her father remained in Alexandria to guarantee his safety, acting as an occupying force, a constant, looming threat to the independence of the very kingdom they guarded. When Ptolemy XII finally died of illness in 51 BC, the Kingdom of Egypt was drowning in massive debt to Rome, its treasury depleted, and its people suffering from severe famine caused by a terrible drought and the failure of the annual Nile flood. In his will, the old king left his shattered, precarious throne to his two eldest surviving children, 18-year-old Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. Following the ancient pharaonic tradition, the teenage sister and the child brother were married and declared co-rulers. But from the very beginning, Cleopatra had absolutely no intention of sharing power. Within months of her father's death, she dropped her brother's name from all official documents. State decrees were issued solely in her name. Coins were minted bearing only her portrait. She presented herself not merely as a queen, but as the living embodiment of Isis, the supreme mother goddess of the Egyptian pantheon, possessing divine right and absolute authority. However, her fierce independence quickly alienated the powerful, conservative Greek courtiers who dominated the royal palace in Alexandria. They despised the idea of a strong, independent female ruler. These men, led by a ruthlessly ambitious eunuch named Pothinus, a brilliant rhetorician named Theodotus, and a seasoned military commander named Achilles, formed a dangerous cabal surrounding the young boy king, Ptolemy XIII. They recognized that the child was easily manipulated and sought to use him as a puppet to seize total control of the Egyptian state. They began a relentless campaign to undermine Cleopatra, blaming her for the crippling famine, the crushing Roman debts, and the general misery of the population. The political atmosphere in the glittering capital grew incredibly toxic. By the year 49 BC, the situation reached a violent breaking point. The cabal surrounding Ptolemy XIII incited a massive uprising in Alexandria. A mob, fueled by hunger and political manipulation, stormed the royal palace. Cleopatra, realizing that her life was in imminent danger, was forced to flee the city of her birth. She did not, however, flee in defeat. She escaped eastward across the unforgiving desert toward the border of Syria, demonstrating a remarkable resilience and strategic mind. Even in exile, she was not powerless. Drawing upon her vast wealth, her linguistic skills, and her undeniable charisma, she began raising a massive mercenary army of her own. She spent the next year encamped on the harsh eastern frontier, gathering soldiers, forging alliances with desert tribes, and preparing for a massive civil war against her own brother to reclaim her stolen throne. The stage was set for a brutal familial conflict that would determine the fate of the wealthiest nation on earth. But as the siblings prepared to tear their kingdom apart, the very earth beneath them seemed to tremble with the approach of a storm far greater than any Egyptian civil war. Across the Mediterranean, the Roman Republic had completely fractured. The two most powerful men in the world, the legendary conqueror Julius Caesar and the brilliant general Pompey the Great, had plunged the known world into a catastrophic civil war of their own. The fate of Rome, and consequently the fate of Egypt, hung entirely in the balance. In the summer of 48 BC, the forces of Caesar and Pompey clashed in the massive, bloody Battle of Pharsalus in central Greece. Against all odds, Julius Caesar emerged victorious, utterly shattering Pompey's legions. Pompey the Great, a man who had once conquered the East and dictated terms to kings, was suddenly a desperate fugitive running for his life. With only a handful of loyal followers and his family, he sailed toward the only place he believed he might find refuge and financial support, Egypt. Pompey had been the political patron of Cleopatra's late father, Ptolemy XII, and he expected the young boy king, Ptolemy XIII, to honor that old alliance and grant him sanctuary. As Pompey's small fleet approached the shores of Pelusium, where the young king's army was camped, awaiting the invasion of Cleopatra's mercenary forces, the Egyptian court faced an impossible decision. To harbor Pompey was to declare war on the seemingly invincible Julius Caesar, inviting the immediate destruction of Egypt. To turn Pompey away might anger his remaining supporters in Rome. The boy king's advisors, led by the cold and calculating Pothinus, chose a third, far more brutal option. They decided to murder Pompey the Great, hoping to present his severed head to Caesar as a gruesome gift, a supreme act of submission designed to win the favor of the new master of the Roman world. As Pompey stepped off his ship into a small Egyptian ferry boat, expecting to be greeted as an honored guest, he was suddenly struck down from behind. He was stabbed to death in full view of his wife and son, who watched in absolute horror from the deck of their ship. His head was severed, and his body was left unceremoniously on the beach. Days later, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria with a shockingly small force of only 4,000 Roman legionaries, expecting to hunt down his rival. Instead, the Egyptian courtiers presented him with the head of Pompey the Great. But they had miscalculated terribly. Caesar was not pleased. He was an incredibly proud Roman, and Pompey, despite being his enemy, was a former consul of Rome and once Caesar's own son-in-law. To see a great Roman general murdered so treacherously by foreign subjects enraged him. He wept openly at the sight of Pompey's signet ring. Furthermore, Caesar was entirely bankrupt. He had fought a massive, exhausting civil war, and he desperately needed the vast wealth of Egypt to pay his massive, restless armies back home. Caesar immediately occupied the royal palace in Alexandria, acting not as a guest, but as a conqueror, dictating terms. He ordered the warring siblings, Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra, to immediately disband their armies and submit to his arbitration. He intended to settle their petty dispute, collect the massive debts their father owed Rome, and leave. Ptolemy XIII, confident in his position and controlling the capital city, agreed to the meeting. But Cleopatra was trapped. She was exiled in the desert, and the city of Alexandria, including the harbor and the palace gates, was heavily guarded by her brother's assassins. to enter the city openly was a guaranteed death sentence. If she could not reach Caesar and present her case, she would lose her kingdom forever. She needed a plan of sheer audacious brilliance. She needed to bypass an entire army and sneak into the heavily guarded bedchamber of the most powerful man on earth. The challenge facing the young, exiled queen was nearly impossible. To reach Julius Caesar, Cleopatra had to cross enemy lines, infiltrate her own heavily fortified capital city, bypass the watchful eyes of her brother's royal guards, and somehow secure a private audience with the most dangerous man in the Mediterranean. She understood that if she was caught, her brother's advisors, especially the ruthless eunuch Pothinus and the seasoned general Achillas, would not hesitate to have her brutally murdered before she ever saw the Roman dictator. She could not march into Alexandria at the head of her mercenary army. That would be an act of war against Rome itself, inviting immediate destruction from Caesar's legendary legions. She had to use her most potent weapon, her mind. She needed a strategy of absolute stealth, daring, and theatrical brilliance. Under the cover of darkness in late autumn of 48 BC, a single, unassuming small boat slipped silently from the shadows of the eastern Mediterranean coast and sailed toward the massive, glittering harbor of Alexandria. On board was Cleopatra, accompanied only by a single trusted servant, a Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus. As they approached the towering walls of the royal palace, bathed in the soft, flickering light of torches and the distant, guiding fire of the Pharos lighthouse, the danger was palpable. The harbor was heavily patrolled by Ptolemy XIII's massive war fleet. To be discovered now meant certain, agonizing death. According to the most famous, romanticized, and enduring legend of antiquity, Cleopatra devised an ingenious plan to smuggle herself into the very heart of the palace. She instructed Apollodorus to roll her up entirely inside a luxurious, tightly woven bed sack, or, as the more popular but perhaps less historically accurate myth suggests, a magnificent oriental carpet. Apollodorus then tied the bundle securely with a sturdy rope, hoisted the heavy burden onto his shoulders, and casually walked past the heavily armed palace guards. He presented himself merely as a common merchant delivering a gift, perhaps a rare tapestry or a fine piece of bedding, directly to the chambers of the great Roman general Julius Caesar. The guards, unsuspecting of a lowly servant carrying a mundane package, allowed him to pass unchallenged. Whether it was a rough linen sack or a vibrant silken carpet, the sheer audacity of the act was undeniably breathtaking. Apollodorus carried the bundle through the opulent, echoing marble corridors of the palace, past golden statues and shimmering pools, until he reached the private quarters of Julius Caesar. There, in the quiet dimness of the room, he gently lowered his burden to the floor and untied the ropes. As the heavy fabric unrolled, it revealed not a lifeless gift, but a 21-year-old queen, flushed from the confined space, her dark hair perhaps slightly disheveled, but her eyes burning with an intense, calculated intelligence. Imagine the absolute astonishment of Julius Caesar, a hardened, battle-scarred military commander of 52 years, a man who had conquered Gaul and crushed his greatest Roman rivals, suddenly presented with the sudden, dramatic materialization of the most powerful woman in the East. This was not the frightened, pleading exile he had summoned to arbitrate a petty dynastic dispute. This was a masterclass in political theater. Cleopatra had completely bypassed the established protocols of diplomacy, bypassed her murderous brother, and placed herself directly, physically, in Caesar's presence. In that single electrifying moment, she seized the narrative. She was no longer a victim, she was a sovereign demanding her rightful throne. Caesar was immediately captivated. He was a man renowned for his legendary charm, his brilliant mind, and his notorious appetite for both power and romance. He recognized instantly that the woman standing before him was not merely beautiful, though ancient sources fiercely debate the nature of her physical appearance, often describing her charm and intellect as far more intoxicating than mere facial features. What truly struck Caesar was her staggering charisma, her razor-sharp wit, and her fluent, flawless Greek, unburdened by the need for an interpreter. She was arguably the most educated, politically astute, and captivating woman he had ever encountered. She possessed a deep, nuanced understanding of global politics, a terrifyingly clear vision of her kingdom's precarious future, and an unwavering, ruthless determination to survive. Throughout that long, fateful night in the royal palace of Alexandria, a profound alliance was forged. It was not merely a romantic entanglement, though it undoubtedly became one. It was a cold, pragmatic, and incredibly powerful political partnership, born of mutual necessity. Cleopatra desperately needed Caesar's invincible legions to crush her brother's forces, reclaim her absolute rule over Egypt, and secure her life against the constant threat of assassination. Caesar, conversely, was bankrupt. He urgently needed the vast, almost unimaginable wealth of the Ptolemaic treasury to pay his massive armies, solidify his dictatorial grip on the fractured Roman Republic, and fund his grand, ambitious building projects back in Rome. They were two brilliant, utterly ruthless minds who found exactly what they needed in each other. By the time the sun rose over the glittering Mediterranean, illuminating the white limestone of Alexandria, the political landscape of the entire known world had shifted dramatically. When the 10-year-old boy king, Ptolemy XIII, awoke and gleefully rushed to the palace to meet the Roman dictator, expecting to be praised for the murder of Pompey the Great and to have his sister permanently exiled, he was met with a shocking, devastating sight. There, sitting openly beside Julius Caesar, completely secure and radiant with newfound power, was his hated older sister, Cleopatra. The young king was completely unhinged by the betrayal. He realized instantly that he had been entirely outmaneuvered. In a blind rage, he tore his royal diadem from his head, dashed it violently against the marble floor, and ran screaming out of the palace and into the bustling streets of Alexandria, crying out to the Egyptian people that he had been betrayed by Rome, that his sister was a treacherous whore, and that their ancient independent kingdom had been sold to a foreign dictator. The already volatile, desperate citizens of Alexandria, fueled by hunger, intense anti-Roman sentiment, and the manipulation of the king's vicious advisors, erupted into absolute chaos. The mob surrounded the royal palace. Pothinus and Achilles, realizing that Caesar's small force of 4,000 men was incredibly vulnerable, immediately mobilized the vast Egyptian royal army, a massive force of over 20,000 highly trained, heavily armed soldiers, many of whom were hardened veterans of previous Roman campaigns. They laid a brutal, suffocating siege to the palace complex. Suddenly, Caesar, the greatest conqueror in the world, found himself trapped behind enemy lines, heavily outnumbered, fighting for his very survival in a foreign capital, alongside his new, brilliant ally, Cleopatra. The Alexandrian War had begun. For months, the situation was incredibly desperate. The palace was completely cut off from the sea and the mainland. Caesar's men fought brutal, bloody street battles against the overwhelming Egyptian forces. The fighting was savage and relentless, spilling into the grand avenues and wealthy districts of the city. In a desperate tactical move to prevent the Egyptian war fleet from cutting off his only avenue of escape or reinforcement by sea, Caesar ordered his men to set fire to the enemy's ships anchored in the great harbor. The inferno was massive, a terrifying spectacle of destruction that illuminated the night sky. However, the flames, driven by strong, unpredictable winds off the Mediterranean, quickly spread from the burning ships to the bustling docks and then violently leapt into the city itself. The fire raged uncontrollably through the streets, consuming warehouses filled with grain and massive public buildings. Tragically, according to many ancient historians, the ravenous flames eventually reached the legendary Library of Alexandria, or at least its massive storehouses near the docks. In that horrific conflagration, countless thousands of irreplaceable papyrus scrolls, containing centuries of accumulated human knowledge, the brilliant works of ancient philosophers, scientists, and poets, were reduced to ash. It was an incalculable, devastating loss for human history, a tragic consequence of a brutal war for power. Yet, despite the chaos, the fire, and the overwhelming odds, Caesar and Cleopatra held out in the besieged palace. They endured the agonizing, claustrophobic months of warfare together, forging a bond that would forever alter the course of history. Their survival depended entirely on their combined intellect, their ruthless determination, and the eventual arrival of Roman reinforcements marching across the unforgiving desert from Syria.
The siege of Alexandria dragged on for agonizing, blood-soaked months, a claustrophobic nightmare of urban warfare that tested even the legendary discipline of Julius Caesar's Roman legionaries. Behind the heavily fortified, opulent walls of the Ptolemaic royal palace, completely cut off from the rest of the Mediterranean world, Caesar and the young Queen Cleopatra were effectively prisoners in their own capital. Outside, the massive Egyptian army, loyal to the boy king Ptolemy XIII and commanded by the ruthless general Achilles, relentlessly battered the palace defenses. The air in the once glittering city was thick with the suffocating smoke of burning ships, the stench of death, and the constant, terrifying roar of angry mobs. Yet within the barricaded walls of the royal compound, a profound and complex relationship was rapidly intensifying between the 52-year-old Roman dictator and the 21-year-old Egyptian queen. This was not merely a desperate alliance forged in the crucible of war. It was an intellectual and physical union of two of the most extraordinary minds of the ancient world. Cleopatra was unlike any woman Caesar had ever known in Rome. She was not a submissive, aristocratic wife confined to the domestic sphere. She was a sovereign monarch, a brilliant political strategist, and a highly educated scholar who could debate philosophy, history, and military tactics with him as an equal. Caesar, a man infamous for his restless ambition and his long string of political marriages and fleeting romances, found himself deeply captivated by Cleopatra's staggering intellect, her unshakable confidence, and her audacious vision for the future of the East. She understood the intricate, treacherous chessboard of global politics just as well as he did. They spent long hours discussing the administration of empires, the history of Alexander the Great, a man they both profoundly admired, and the vast, untapped wealth of the Egyptian kingdom.
During these tense months of siege, their political partnership blossomed into a passionate, history-altering romance. Meanwhile, the situation outside the palace was growing increasingly desperate. Caesar's small force of roughly 4,000 men was stretched to the absolute breaking point, defending a massive perimeter against tens of thousands of Egyptian soldiers. The city's water supply to the palace was deliberately contaminated with seawater by the besieging forces, forcing the Romans to desperately dig deep wells within the compound to survive. The fighting was vicious, often hand-to-hand combat in the narrow, labyrinthine streets surrounding the royal quarters. It was during this chaotic period that Cleopatra's younger sister, the fiercely ambitious Princess Arsinoe, managed to escape the heavily guarded palace. Arsinoe had always harbored a bitter hatred for Cleopatra and a deep burning desire for the throne. She slipped through the Roman lines, joined the Egyptian army commanded by Achilles, and boldly declared herself the true queen of Egypt. The rebel forces eagerly embraced her, finding in Arsinoe a legitimate Ptolemaic royal who actively opposed both her sister and the hated Roman occupiers. The war had suddenly become a brutal three-way familial conflict. Cleopatra aligned with Caesar inside the palace, while her brother Ptolemy XIII and her sister Arsinoe commanded massive armies outside. However, the tide of the war was about to turn drastically. In early 47 BC, after months of desperate waiting, word finally reached Alexandria that massive Roman reinforcements were marching swiftly across the harsh Sinai desert from Syria, led by a fiercely loyal ally of Caesar named Mithridates of Pergamum. These fresh, battle-hardened legions smashed through the Egyptian border defenses at Pelusium and marched rapidly toward the capital, threatening to encircle the massive army of Ptolemy XIII. Realizing the immense danger of being trapped between Caesar's forces breaking out of the palace and the advancing Roman relief army, the young Egyptian king, heavily influenced by his panic-stricken advisors, made a fatal tactical error. He abandoned the siege of Alexandria and marched his entire army outward to meet the incoming Roman reinforcements in open battle near the muddy banks of the Nile River. It was exactly the kind of conventional open-field warfare that the Roman legions excelled at. Caesar, ever the brilliant tactician, instantly seized the opportunity. He broke out of the besieged palace, joined his forces with the newly arrived legions of Mithridates, and ruthlessly cornered the Egyptian army. The ensuing Battle of the Nile was an absolute slaughter. The highly disciplined Roman war machine utterly annihilated the forces of Ptolemy XIII. The Egyptian soldiers, realizing they were surrounded and facing total destruction, broke ranks and fled in absolute terror toward the river, desperately trying to reach the safety of their naval ships anchored offshore. In the chaotic, bloody retreat, thousands of Egyptian soldiers were cut down by Roman swords or drowned in the dark, swirling waters of the Nile. Among the dead was the young boy king himself, Ptolemy XIII. His heavily armored royal barge, overloaded with terrified, fleeing soldiers, capsized and sank rapidly into the murky depths of the river. His body was never recovered. The brutal, devastating civil war that had threatened to tear the wealthiest nation on earth apart was over. Julius Caesar had conquered Egypt, not for Rome, but for Cleopatra. With her brother dead and her sister Arsinoe captured in chains, Cleopatra was finally the undisputed, absolute ruler of the entire Egyptian kingdom. She returned to the royal palace in Alexandria no longer as an exiled, desperate princess, but as a triumphant, uncontested queen, backed by the terrifying, invincible military might of the Roman Republic. However, Caesar, acting as a supreme dictator and a shrewd politician, understood that the Egyptian people, deeply steeped in ancient traditions, would never accept a sole female ruler, especially one entirely propped up by foreign swords. To maintain the illusion of legitimacy and appease the conservative factions in Alexandria, he forced Cleopatra to marry her youngest surviving brother, the 12-year-old Ptolemy XIV, and declare him her co-ruler. It was an entirely ceremonial marriage, a cynical political fiction designed to stabilize the turbulent country. Cleopatra had absolutely no intention of sharing a fraction of her power with another sibling. She was now the wealthiest woman in the known world, and she owed her life, her throne, and her absolute authority entirely to Julius Caesar. Yet, in a shocking, unprecedented move that defied all Roman political logic and deeply alarmed his generals back in Rome, Caesar did not immediately annex Egypt as a subjugated province of the Republic, as he had done with Gaul. Instead of turning Egypt into a massive, heavily taxed Roman territory, he left the independent kingdom entirely in the hands of Cleopatra. This decision was largely driven by his intense personal infatuation with the brilliant young queen, but it was also a masterstroke of cold, pragmatic strategy. Caesar knew that a stable, prosperous, and independently ruled Egypt, permanently indebted to him personally, was far more valuable than a rebellious, occupied province constantly requiring massive Roman military resources to control. Furthermore, he desperately needed the staggering agricultural wealth of the Nile Valley, the millions of tons of grain harvested annually, to feed the massive, restive population of Rome and secure his absolute political dominance back home. Before returning to Rome to finally crush the remaining remnants of Pompey's shattered Republican forces and declare himself dictator for life, Caesar spent several luxurious, intoxicating months in Egypt with Cleopatra. Leaving behind the blood, the ash, and the brutal politics of war, the two most powerful people in the world embarked on a legendary, extravagant pleasure cruise up the magnificent, winding Nile River. They sailed southward for weeks aboard a colossal floating palace, a magnificent royal barge described by ancient historians as a staggering feat of engineering. It was said to be hundreds of feet long, constructed of fragrant cedar wood, adorned with glittering gold, ivory, and precious gems, and featuring sprawling, luxurious staterooms, colonnaded walkways, and even terraced gardens. Accompanied by a massive, intimidating flotilla of 400 Roman warships designed to ensure their absolute safety and publicly display their terrifying combined power, they traveled deep into the heart of ancient Egypt, far beyond the Hellenistic, Greek-speaking capital of Alexandria. This journey was far more than mere romantic holiday. It was a deeply symbolic, highly calculated political tour. For the very first time in centuries, a ruling Ptolemaic monarch was traveling deep into the Egyptian countryside to actively engage with her subjects, to participate in ancient religious ceremonies at the massive, towering temples of Luxor and Karnak, and to visually solidify her image not just as a Greek queen, but as a true divine pharaoh of Egypt. And beside her stood the undisputed master of the Roman world, a living god in the eyes of his soldiers.
As the magnificent gold-laden royal barge drifted slowly upstream, deep into the ancient sun-baked heart of the Egyptian countryside, Cleopatra deliberately transformed her image from a Hellenistic Greek queen into the living incarnation of the most powerful and beloved deity in the Egyptian pantheon, the goddess Isis. It was a brilliant, highly calculated move of religious and political propaganda. Isis was not just any goddess, she was the divine mother, the protector of the throne, the eternal symbol of magic, healing, and absolute royal legitimacy. By closely associating herself with Isis, appearing in public wearing the traditional horned headdress with the sun disk, and participating in ancient sacred rituals at towering temples that had stood for thousands of years, Cleopatra cemented a profound emotional connection with the millions of native Egyptian people she ruled. She was no longer just a distant Greek-speaking monarch isolated in the foreign coastal city of Alexandria. She was their divine mother, the protector of the Nile, and the rightful heir to the legacy of the great pharaohs of old. And standing beside this living goddess, awestruck by the sheer scale, the staggering wealth, and the unimaginable antiquity of the land, was Julius Caesar. For a man who had spent his entire adult life in the brutal, cutthroat, often Spartan world of Roman military campaigns and senatorial politics, Egypt was a revelation of absolute, intoxicating luxury and absolute, unquestioned monarchy. Rome, for all its terrifying military might, was still fiercely proud of its republican traditions, deeply suspicious of kings, and aggressively resistant to any single man holding permanent, absolute power. But in Egypt, Caesar witnessed a system of government where the ruler was not just a politician, but a god on earth, commanding unimaginable wealth, unquestioned obedience, and a culture that celebrated supreme, centralized authority. Many ancient historians and modern scholars believe that this extensive, luxurious tour of the Nile with Cleopatra fundamentally altered Caesar's own political ambitions. The intoxicating taste of absolute, divine kingship, combined with the staggering financial resources of Egypt now at his personal disposal, likely fueled his growing desire to dismantle the crumbling Roman Republic and establish himself not merely as a temporary dictator, but as a permanent, absolute monarch of the entire Roman world. Their time together on the Nile was not only politically transformative, but also deeply personal. During this period, Cleopatra became pregnant with Caesar's child. This was a monumental development with massive global implications. While Caesar had been married several times in Rome, he had only one legitimate daughter, Julia, who had tragically died in childbirth years earlier. He had no legitimate male heir to inherit his vast fortune, his political legacy, or his terrifying military power. When Caesar finally departed Egypt in 47 BC to crush the remaining Republican forces in North Africa and Spain, he left behind 3 heavily armed Roman legions, not as an occupying force, but as a personal bodyguard for Cleopatra, ensuring her absolute grip on the Egyptian throne against any remaining internal threats. He also left behind a kingdom that was completely, inextricably tied to his own political survival in Rome. A few months after his departure, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy XV Philopator Philomator Caesar, but the people of Alexandria, and soon the entire world, would know him by a much more famous, mocking nickname, Caesarion, which meant Little Caesar.
Cleopatra boldly and publicly declared that the child was the biological son of the most powerful man on earth. She proudly displayed him on newly minted coins, presenting him as the physical union of the 2 greatest powers in the Mediterranean, the ancient divine bloodline of the Ptolemies and the invincible military might of Rome. For Cleopatra, Caesarion was her ultimate insurance policy, the living proof of her unbreakable bond with the master of the Roman world and a potential future ruler of a unified global empire. In 46 BC, Julius Caesar returned to Rome in absolute triumph, having utterly destroyed his enemies and secured his position as dictator for life. The city celebrated him with massive, unprecedented, and staggering public spectacles. 4 spectacular triumphs spread over several weeks, featuring massive parades of captured wealth, enslaved kings, and exotic animals. Rome had never seen such a display of absolute, terrifying power and unimaginable riches. It was during this heady, intoxicating period of supreme dominance that Caesar made a decision that deeply shocked and alienated the conservative, traditionalist senators of Rome. He invited Cleopatra to live in his own magnificent villa across the Tiber River, just outside the city walls. Cleopatra did not arrive in Rome quietly or modestly. She arrived as a conquering queen, accompanied by a massive, dazzling royal retinue of courtiers, scholars, eunuchs, slaves, and astonishing wealth that made the austere Roman senators gasp in both awe and intense disgust. And she brought with her the young boy, Caesarion. Her presence in Rome was highly controversial and deeply polarizing. To the common people, she was a fascinating, exotic spectacle, a symbol of Rome's incredible global reach and the staggering wealth pouring into the city from the conquered East. But to the powerful, conservative elite of the Roman Senate, men who despised the very concept of kingship and deeply feared the concentration of absolute power in the hands of one man, Cleopatra was a terrifying, corrupting influence. They saw her as a dangerous, foreign seductress who had entirely ensnared their brilliant general. Worse, they feared that she was filling Caesar's mind with toxic, un-Roman ideas of divine monarchy and absolute rule. The fact that Caesar openly displayed a golden statue of Cleopatra in the sacred temple of Venus Genetrix, the mythical founding goddess of his own family line, was seen as an appalling, unforgivable sacrilege. The rumors swirling through the narrow, crowded streets of Rome were poisonous and highly dangerous. It was whispered that Caesar intended to marry the Egyptian queen, despite being married to a Roman woman named Calpurnia, and move the capital of the empire from Rome to the wealthy, culturally superior city of Alexandria. It was whispered that he intended to crown himself king of Rome, effectively destroying the ancient republic that had stood for 500 years, and name his half-Egyptian bastard son Caesarion as his heir. These fears, fueled by Caesar's increasingly arrogant behavior, his massive, unprecedented accumulation of power, and his blatant disregard for republican traditions, eventually crystallized into a deadly, far-reaching conspiracy among the highest levels of the Roman aristocracy. Dozens of powerful senators, led by men who had once been his friends and political allies, men like Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, believed that the only way to save the republic from tyranny was to eliminate the tyrant himself. On the fateful morning of the Ides of March, the 15th of March, 44 BC, Julius Caesar walked confidently into the massive, sweeping stone hall of the Theater of Pompey for a meeting of the Senate. He was unarmed, dismissing his usual heavily armed bodyguard of Spanish mercenaries, perhaps believing that his absolute power and the sheer force of his personality made him untouchable. It was a fatal miscalculation. As he took his seat on the golden chair of state, a group of frantic, heavily armed senators suddenly crowded around him under the pretense of presenting a petition. Within seconds, the petition turned into a frenzied, bloody assault. Dozens of daggers flashed in the dim light of the Senate House. Caesar fought back violently at first, but overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers, including men he had deeply trusted, he finally pulled his toga over his head in a poignant gesture of defeat and collapsed, bleeding to death from 23 stab wounds at the base of a statue of his old rival, Pompey the Great. The assassination of Julius Caesar was an earth-shattering event that plunged the entire Roman world into immediate, catastrophic chaos. For Cleopatra, who was still living in Rome at the time, the murder was not just a political disaster, it was an intensely personal tragedy and an immediate, terrifying threat to her own survival and the future of her kingdom.
The immediate aftermath of Julius Caesar's bloody assassination on the Ides of March in 44 BC was a period of absolute, terrifying paralysis in Rome. The conspirators, standing over the bleeding, mangled corpse of the man who had effectively ruled the known world, naively believed they would be hailed as liberators by the Roman people. They believed that with the tyrant dead, the ancient, noble republic would simply snap back into existence. Instead, their violent act unleashed a political earthquake that would ultimately shatter the Roman state forever and drag the entire Mediterranean world, including the Golden Kingdom of Egypt, into a massive, catastrophic civil war. For Cleopatra, the news of Caesar's murder was not merely shocking, it was an apocalyptic threat to everything she had built. She was isolated, vulnerable, and deeply exposed in a hostile foreign capital. She was residing in Caesar's magnificent villa across the Tiber River, surrounded by her opulent retinue, but entirely devoid of the invincible protection of his Roman legions. The man who had secured her throne, fathered her child, and shielded her from the predatory ambitions of Rome was gone, butchered on the floor of the Senate House. Worse still, she was immediately targeted by the furious aristocratic conspirators who had despised her immense influence over Caesar and deeply feared the half-Roman, half-Egyptian boy, Caesarion, as a potential tyrannical heir to the Roman world. Cleopatra's survival instincts, honed in the ruthless, murderous court of Alexandria, immediately took over. She realized with chilling clarity that Rome was no longer safe. The city was a powder keg, teetering on the edge of mass violence. She wasted no time. Within weeks of the assassination, before the political dust had even begun to settle and the inevitable civil war could erupt, she quietly and swiftly gathered her vast wealth, her courtiers, and her infant son, and fled the city under the cover of darkness. She sailed back across the treacherous Mediterranean, returning to the only place where she commanded absolute authority and possessed the military and financial resources to weather the coming storm, the magnificent, heavily fortified capital of Alexandria. Upon returning to Egypt, Cleopatra was not a defeated refugee. She was a fiercely independent monarch determined to secure her power at all costs. She immediately asserted her absolute authority over the deeply unsettled kingdom. In a move that perfectly mirrored the ruthless logic of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and echoing the cold, calculated murders of her own siblings years earlier, she allegedly ordered the assassination of her younger brother and co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV. The teenage king, who had been a mere ceremonial figurehead since his forced marriage to Cleopatra by Caesar, died suddenly, likely by poisoning, shortly after her return. This brutal act of political consolidation eliminated any potential rival to the throne and allowed Cleopatra to formally elevate the true heir she had chosen. In a deeply symbolic and historically monumental ceremony, she proclaimed her young son, Caesarion, as her official co-ruler and the absolute heir to the Egyptian empire.
she gave him the magnificent title King of Kings, a direct, undeniable challenge to any Roman who might try to claim the legacy of Julius Caesar. For Cleopatra, Caesarion was not just a son, he was her most potent political weapon, the living embodiment of a potential future empire that would unite the East and the West under the bloodline of Caesar and the Ptolemies.
Meanwhile, back in Rome, the political situation had rapidly degenerated into total chaos. The assassins, led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, realized they had deeply misjudged the mood of the Roman people, who had largely adored Caesar for his spectacular generosity and brilliant military victories. Facing massive violent riots orchestrated by Caesar's fiercely loyal general Mark Antony, the conspirators were forced to flee Rome, abandoning the capital to the chaotic, bloody struggle for power among Caesar's remaining supporters. The two most powerful men to emerge from the wreckage of Caesar's regime were Mark Antony, a seasoned, fiercely loyal, and incredibly charismatic military commander who had been Caesar's trusted right hand, and a surprisingly young, frail, but terrifyingly ambitious 18-year-old named Gaius Octavius, commonly known as Octavian. In his will, Caesar had completely ignored his biological son, Caesarion, and surprisingly adopted his great-nephew, Octavian, making him his primary heir and legally passing on his immense fortune and his legendary name. This unexpected revelation set the stage for a massive, inevitable collision between Antony, the seasoned, hardened general who expected to inherit Caesar's political mantle, and Octavian, the young, legally brilliant heir who ruthlessly exploited his adoptive father's name to rally Caesar's fiercely loyal legions to his own cause. Despite their intense mutual hatred and deep suspicion, Antony and Octavian, realizing they needed to eliminate the massive armies of the conspirators first, forged a fragile, blood-soaked alliance known as the Second Triumvirate, joining forces with another powerful general named Lepidus. In 42 BC, the combined massive forces of Antony and Octavian marched into northern Greece and confronted the massive republican armies of Brutus and Cassius at the monumental, apocalyptic Battle of Philippi. It was one of the largest and most destructive battles in Roman history. The fighting was savage and relentless. In the end, the forces of the Triumvirate, largely led by the brilliant tactical command of Mark Antony, crushed the Republican armies. Facing total defeat and the agonizing destruction of their cause, both Brutus and Cassius committed suicide. The Roman Republic was officially dead, and the killers of Caesar had been violently avenged. With their mutual enemies destroyed, Antony and Octavian ruthlessly divided the massive, sprawling Roman world between them. Octavian, ever the shrewd politician, took control of Rome, Italy, and the increasingly restless western provinces, solidifying his political base in the heart of the empire. Mark Antony, the seasoned military commander, chose the vast, incredibly wealthy, and deeply complex eastern provinces, a sprawling territory that stretched from Greece and Asia Minor all the way to the borders of the terrifying Parthian Empire in the east. Antony's primary objective in the east was to launch a massive punitive invasion of Parthia, a powerful empire in modern-day Iran that had humiliated and annihilated Roman legions years earlier. He intended to avenge this ancient insult, secure his own military glory to eclipse that of Octavian, and fund this massive, incredibly expensive campaign. To do so, he desperately needed money.
And in the entire Mediterranean world, there was only one place with the staggering, almost unimaginable wealth necessary to bankroll such an apocalyptic war. The golden, independent kingdom of Egypt, ruled by the wealthiest woman on earth, Queen Cleopatra. In the summer of 41 BC, Mark Antony, acting not just as a Roman general, but as a supreme, almost divine ruler of the East, set up his magnificent headquarters in the wealthy coastal city of Tarsus, in modern-day Turkey. From this opulent base, he summoned the rulers, kings, and diplomats of the eastern provinces to pay homage, settle disputes, and, most importantly, provide massive financial tributes to fund his impending Parthian campaign. Among those summoned, with a deeply arrogant and commanding tone, was Cleopatra. Antony demanded that she answer allegations that she had secretly provided financial aid to the assassins of Julius Caesar, a deeply cynical, politically motivated charge designed entirely to extort massive sums of money from the Egyptian treasury. Cleopatra, however, was not a petty, subjugated client queen who could be summoned like a common criminal. She was the absolute monarch of the wealthiest nation on earth, a brilliant political strategist, and a woman who had already charmed and partnered with the greatest Roman conqueror in history. She understood perfectly that Antony did not want justice, he wanted her gold, and she knew exactly how to negotiate. The summons from Mark Antony arrived in Alexandria like a heavy, thunderous demand from a new, aggressive master of the Roman East. He expected the Queen of Egypt, arguably the wealthiest and most politically astute monarch in the known world, to present herself at his opulent headquarters in Tarsus, modern-day Turkey, as a penitent vassal state, begging for Roman favor and offering massive financial tributes to fund his grandiose invasion of the Parthian Empire. He expected a frightened, submissive woman, desperate to clear her name of the cynical, politically motivated charges that she had secretly aided the assassins of Julius Caesar. He anticipated a desperate plea for survival. But Cleopatra, possessing a brilliant, deeply strategic mind and an unmatched understanding of political theater, had absolutely no intention of arriving in Tarsus as a subjugated captive or a common criminal. She understood Mark Antony far better than he understood her. She knew he was a fiercely ambitious, hardened military commander, deeply arrogant, famously indulgent in wine and extravagance, and entirely driven by a desperate need for absolute power and unimaginable wealth to eclipse his young, calculating rival in Rome, Octavian. She realized that he did not want justice. He wanted her gold, her grain, and her strategic naval fleet. Instead of hurrying to Tarsus in a panic, Cleopatra deliberately and provocatively delayed her departure. She ignored his repeated, increasingly angry summons, forcing the most powerful Roman in the East to wait on her schedule. This was a calculated psychological tactic designed to assert her absolute sovereignty and build an atmosphere of intense anticipation. When she finally did set sail across the Mediterranean in the late summer of 41 BC, her arrival in Tarsus was not a diplomatic mission. It was a staggering, theatrical masterpiece of sensory overload and sheer, breathtaking power. She sailed up the Cydnus River not in a humble merchant vessel, but aboard a magnificent, colossal royal barge that defied imagination. The ancient historian Plutarch, writing decades later, described a scene of unparalleled luxury that became the stuff of legend. The ship's massive stern was completely plated in pure, glittering gold. The colossal sails were woven from the finest, most vibrant purple Tyrian silk, the most expensive dye in the ancient world, a color exclusively reserved for royalty and gods. The massive silver oars beat the dark water in perfect hypnotic rhythm to the sound of enchanting flutes, fifes, and deeply resonant lutes. As the colossal vessel glided majestically toward the packed, bustling docks of Tarsus, the air itself grew heavy with the intoxicating scent of exotic perfumes and burning incense, wafting from the ship and enveloping the thousands of spectators who had rushed to the riverbanks in absolute awe. And at the center of this sensory explosion, reclining beneath a magnificent gold-embroidered canopy, was Cleopatra. She was dressed not as a Hellenistic Greek queen or a Roman aristocrat, but as the living embodiment of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and irresistible desire. She was surrounded by beautiful young boys painted as cupids, gently fanning her with massive, vibrant ostrich feathers, while her maids, dressed perfectly as sea nymphs and graces, managed the shimmering ropes and the massive rudder of the ship. The visual impact was devastating. Mark Antony, who had been sitting in the grand, bustling marketplace of Tarsus, holding court as a supreme Roman magistrate, suddenly found himself completely abandoned by the massive crowds. Everyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest Roman officials, had rushed to the river to witness the breathtaking arrival of the Egyptian goddess. In a single brilliant stroke of political theater, Cleopatra completely reversed the power dynamic. She was not the accused, she was the divine host, commanding the total attention of the city and rendering the most powerful man in the East instantly spellbound. Antony, completely outmaneuvered and deeply intrigued, sent an urgent invitation for the queen to join him for a grand official dinner at his headquarters. Cleopatra politely but firmly declined, asserting her royal prerogative by insisting that he come to her barge instead. And Antony, the hardened, arrogant conqueror, capitulated. He went to her. What followed over the next several nights was a series of extravagant, mind-boggling banquets that completely shattered Antony's Roman sensibilities. Cleopatra hosted feasts of unimaginable luxury, showering the Roman general and his key officers with priceless gifts of gold, exquisite jewels, massive silver vessels, and fine tapestries. Each night, she escalated the display of wealth, demonstrating unequivocally that the entire treasury of Rome paled in comparison to the staggering ancient riches of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The political negotiations that followed were swift and deeply unequal. Cleopatra effortlessly charmed Antony, engaging him in brilliant, witty conversation, matching his bawdy humor, and drinking him under the table, proving herself to be his intellectual equal and a fiercely capable partner. The cynical charges against her were immediately dropped, and in a chilling display of her newfound influence over the Roman commander, she convinced Antony to order the immediate execution of her rebellious younger sister, Arsinoe, who had sought sanctuary in the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Even the sacred protections of ancient gods were no match for the political alliance forged in Tarsus. Cleopatra secured her absolute grip on the Egyptian throne, eliminated her last dynastic rival, and forged a deeply personal and political alliance with the master of the Roman East. Antony, in return, secured the massive financial backing he desperately needed for his impending, grandiose invasion of the Parthian Empire. It was an alliance forged not just in physical attraction, but in cold, pragmatic, mutual necessity. They were two highly ambitious rulers who recognized that their individual survival and their grand global visions were now inextricably linked. In the winter of 4140 BC, Mark Antony abandoned his urgent military preparations, completely ignored the volatile, dangerous political situation brewing back in Rome with Octavian, and followed Cleopatra back to the glittering capital of Alexandria. For a man accustomed to the brutal Spartan life of Roman military campaigns, Alexandria was a revelation of absolute intoxicating pleasure and unparalleled intellectual sophistication. Cleopatra introduced Antony to a world of exquisite refinement, philosophical debate, and staggering luxury that Rome could only dream of. They formed a legendary exclusive drinking club known as the Inimitable Livers, a group dedicated to extravagant feasts, intellectual pursuits, and famously wandering the chaotic, vibrant streets of Alexandria at night in disguise, playing pranks on the local citizens. It was a period of intense, deeply personal bonding, solidifying a partnership that would violently shape the destiny of the entire Mediterranean world for the next decade. But their Alexandrian winter of indulgence was abruptly shattered by terrifying news from the borders of his eastern provinces. While Antony feasted in Egypt, the massive, highly disciplined armies of the Parthian Empire, the very enemy he had sworn to destroy, had launched a devastating lightning-fast invasion of Roman Syria and Asia Minor. The Parthian cavalry, sweeping across the desert like a violent sandstorm, utterly crushed the Roman defenses, capturing massive swaths of territory and threatening the entire Roman control of the East. Antony's massive, costly war machine was collapsing before it had even fully deployed. Simultaneously, even more disastrous news arrived from Italy. Antony's fierce, deeply ambitious wife, Fulvia, and his brother, Lucius, had aggressively launched an armed rebellion against Octavian in Rome, attempting to seize absolute political control of Italy in Antony's name. The rebellion was poorly planned and brutally crushed by Octavian's brilliant, ruthless young general, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. The city of Perusia, where the rebels had made their last stand, was besieged, starved into submission, and viciously sacked by Octavian's forces. Fulvia, broken and defeated, fled eastward to meet her husband, only to die suddenly in Greece shortly after their bitter reunion. Antony was trapped between two catastrophic crises. He had to abandon his idyllic life with Cleopatra, leaving her pregnant with twins, a boy named Alexander Helios, the sun, and a girl named Cleopatra Selene, the moon, and desperately rush back to Italy to prevent a massive, apocalyptic civil war with his heavily armed, deeply suspicious rival, Octavian. The two most powerful men in the world met in 40 BC at the Italian coastal city of Brundisium. Tensions were incredibly high, and the massive, battle-hardened legions of both men were fully mobilized, preparing to tear the Roman Republic apart once again. But neither side truly wanted a massive, destructive war. In a tense, highly pragmatic political compromise known as the Pact of Brundisium, they ruthlessly re-divided the Roman world. Octavian solidified his absolute control over the West, Antony retained the wealthy East, and they sealed their fragile, deeply untrusting alliance with a cynical, highly calculated political marriage. Mark Antony, a man who had just spent the winter acting as the divine consort to the Queen of Egypt, was legally married to Octavia, the fiercely loyal, highly respected, and deeply traditional sister of his greatest rival, Octavian. It was a profound public humiliation for Cleopatra, and a clear signal that Antony's political survival in Rome required him to forge alliances with the very man she deeply feared. The political marriage between Mark Antony and Octavia in 40 BC was celebrated in Rome as a masterstroke of diplomacy, a desperate, hopeful bandage applied to the gaping wounds of a fractured republic. For the war-weary citizens of Italy, who had endured decades of brutal civil strife, The union of the two most powerful factions seemed to promise a permanent golden era of peace. Octavia was universally admired, a woman of pristine Roman virtue, fiercely intelligent, deeply loyal to her brother Octavian, yet genuinely dedicated to making her new, highly volatile marriage work. She quickly became pregnant, and for nearly 3 years, Antony remained in the West, largely managing his sprawling eastern provinces from the civilized comfort of Athens, playing the role of the dutiful Roman husband and the responsible triumvir. But the peace of Brundisium was an illusion, a fragile truce built on a foundation of profound mutual paranoia and irreconcilable ambition. Octavian, cold, calculating, and ruthlessly efficient, spent these years systematically consolidating his absolute grip on Italy, the western provinces, and, crucially, the loyalty of Caesar's veteran legions. He understood that a final apocalyptic showdown with Antony was not merely possible, it was historically inevitable. There could only be one master of the Roman world. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles across the Mediterranean, in the glittering, opulent capital of Alexandria, Queen Cleopatra watched the political machinations of Rome with a mixture of cold calculation and rising anxiety. The news of Antony's marriage to Octavia had been a bitter public sting, a stark reminder that in the brutal arithmetic of Roman power politics, she was considered expendable, a wealthy foreign mistress to be discarded when a politically advantageous Roman alliance presented itself. Yet Cleopatra was not a woman to be discarded. She had birthed Antony's twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and she had spent the intervening years quietly, ruthlessly strengthening her absolute control over the vast Egyptian economy. She expanded her naval fleet, filled her treasuries with unimaginable wealth, and meticulously suppressed any hint of internal dissent. She knew that Antony's grand, obsessive ambition to conquer the Parthian Empire, the very ambition that had brought him to her in Tarsus, was merely delayed, not abandoned. And she knew that when he finally launched that massive, ruinously expensive war, he would inevitably be forced to return to the only source of funding capable of sustaining it, the golden coffers of Egypt. Her calculations were flawless. In 37 BC, the fragile alliance between Antony and Octavian began to violently unravel. Antony, frustrated by Octavian's constant political maneuvering in Italy and his failure to provide the promised troops for the eastern campaigns, realized that his position in the West was slowly being suffocated. He needed a spectacular, earth-shattering military victory in the East to eclipse Octavian's growing prestige and secure his own absolute dominance. He needed Parthia, and to conquer Parthia, he needed Cleopatra. Antony abruptly left Octavia in Italy, pregnant with their second child, and sailed east to the ancient Syrian city of Antioch. It was a decisive, history-altering rupture. He sent an urgent, undeniable summons to the Queen of Egypt. When Cleopatra arrived in Antioch, it was not as a subordinate client ruler, but as a fully realized, indispensable political partner. The reunion was intensely passionate, but it was also a cold, hard negotiation of immense geopolitical consequence. Cleopatra demanded and received unprecedented concessions. In a shocking display of his absolute authority over the eastern Roman provinces, Antony legally transferred massive, wealthy territories directly to Cleopatra and her children. He granted her control over Cyprus, the rich coastal cities of Phoenicia, the lucrative balsam groves of Judea, and significant portions of Cilicia and Arabia. This was not merely a romantic gift, it was a massive strategic restructuring of the entire Near East. Antony was effectively dismantling Roman provinces and handing them to a foreign queen, deeply enraging the conservative senators back in Rome and providing Octavian with the ultimate, highly destructive propaganda weapon. Furthermore, Antony publicly acknowledged his paternity of the twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and legally married Cleopatra in a ceremony that, while highly significant in the East, was considered completely invalid and profoundly scandalous under strict Roman law, as he was still legally married to Octavia. In the eyes of Octavian and his highly effective propaganda machine in Italy, Antony had not just taken a foreign wife, he had gone entirely native. He had abandoned his Roman dignity, his legal wife, and his duty to the Republic, becoming utterly enslaved by the dark, corrupting magic of an Oriental sorceress. Fueled by the staggering wealth of the newly expanded Egyptian Empire, Antony finally launched his massive, long-awaited invasion of the Parthian Empire in 36 BC. It was one of the largest, most expensive military campaigns in Roman history, a colossal force of over 100,000 heavily armed legionaries, allied cavalry, and massive siege engines marching deep into the harsh, unforgiving mountains of modern-day Armenia and Iran. He intended to emulate the legendary conquests of Alexander the Great. Instead, the campaign was a catastrophic, unmitigated disaster. The Parthians, masters of mobile, hit-and-run cavalry warfare and deadly horse archers, entirely outmaneuvered the massive, slow-moving Roman war machine. They ruthlessly severed Antony's supply lines, destroyed his critical siege equipment before it could even be deployed, and subjected the retreating Roman legions to weeks of agonizing, relentless attacks in the freezing, mountainous terrain. It was a humiliating, bloody rout, reminiscent of the annihilation of Crassus decades earlier. Antony lost tens of thousands of his best veteran soldiers to battle, starvation, and extreme cold. He barely managed to drag the shattered, starving remnants of his once invincible army back across the border into friendly territory. His reputation as a brilliant, undefeated military commander was completely shattered. The psychological blow was devastating. He was broken, deeply depressed, and politically vulnerable. As the ragged, freezing survivors stumbled into the coastal city of Leuc-Comi in modern-day Lebanon, Antony did not send for his legal Roman wife, Octavia, who had faithfully gathered fresh troops and supplies in Athens to rush to his aid. Instead, he sent an urgent, desperate message to Alexandria. Cleopatra arrived swiftly, sailing up the coast with a massive fleet heavily laden with vast quantities of food, warm clothing, vital medical supplies, and mountains of silver to pay the mutinous, starving Roman soldiers. She saved Antony's army from total disintegration, and in doing so, firmly established herself not just as his financial backer, but as his absolute savior and equal partner. When Octavia attempted to bring her own supplies from Athens, Antony, entirely under the sway of Cleopatra and deeply humiliated by his defeat, coldly ordered his loyal Roman wife to turn back to Italy. It was a profound, public insult to Octavian's family and a definitive, undeniable declaration of war. The final, fatal rupture had occurred. Octavian, seizing upon the catastrophic Parthian defeat and the deeply offensive rejection of his virtuous sister, unleashed a massive, relentless, and brilliant propaganda war against Mark Antony. He painted his former ally not as a Roman general, but a pathetic, drunken, effeminate slave to a foreign whore. He claimed that Antony intended to move the sacred capital of the Roman Empire from Italy to the decadent Greek-speaking city of Alexandria, and that he planned to subject the proud free citizens of Rome to the absolute tyrannical rule of an Egyptian queen. The climax of this highly calculated political theater occurred in 34 BC, when Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria to stage a deeply controversial, monumentally arrogant spectacle known as the Donations of Alexandria. In the grand open-air gymnasium of the city, sitting on massive thrones of solid gold atop a massive silver platform, Antony and Cleopatra presented themselves not as mortals, but as living gods, the new Dionysus and the new Isis. Before a massive, roaring crowd of Alexandrians and terrified Roman officials, Antony systematically carved up the entire Roman East, distributing vast kingdoms and unconquered territories to Cleopatra and her children. He proclaimed Cleopatra the Queen of Kings, elevating her above all other monarchs. He named her young son, Caesarion, the King of Kings, and explicitly, dangerously declared him the true, legitimate son and heir of Julius Caesar, a direct, existential threat to Octavian's entire political legitimacy. He even granted vast, sweeping territories to their own young children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and a newborn son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. When news of this astonishing, unprecedented event reached Rome, the Senate erupted in absolute, terrifying fury. Octavian had finally gained the ultimate political ammunition he needed. The Donations of Alexandria were seen as an act of supreme treason, a blatant attempt to dismantle the Roman Empire and hand it over to a foreign dynasty. The fragile peace was entirely shattered. The Mediterranean world, exhausted and traumatized by decades of violence, was rapidly plunging headlong toward the final apocalyptic clash that would determine the fate of Western civilization.
The aftermath of the Donations of Alexandria sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean, rippling all the way to the cold marble halls of the Roman Senate. Octavian, ever the master manipulator of public perception, seized upon Antony's grandiose, theatrical display as the absolute, undeniable proof of his treason. The young, calculating heir of Caesar launched a propaganda campaign so vicious, so relentless, and so incredibly effective that its echoes still heavily shape our modern understanding of Cleopatra today. In Rome, rumors were deliberately spread like wildfire, painting the Egyptian queen not as a brilliant sovereign and a stabilizing political force, but as a wicked, decadent enchantress. It was whispered that she had used dark foreign magic and intoxicating poisons to completely enslave the mind of a once great Roman general, stripping Antony of his reason, his dignity, and his honor. But propaganda alone, no matter how toxic, was not enough to trigger a full-scale war. Octavian needed a solid, legal pretext to mobilize the vast legions of Italy against his former ally. In 32 BC, he took a step that was considered a profound, unforgivable sacrilege, even in the ruthless, cynical world of Roman politics. Accompanied by a heavily armed escort, Octavian marched directly into the sacred temple of the Vestal Virgins in the very heart of Rome, a holy sanctuary where the most closely guarded, secret documents of the Republic were kept safe by virgin priestesses. There, defying ancient religious law, he illegally seized Mark Antony's private, sealed will and carried it back to be read aloud before the entire Senate.
Whether the document was entirely genuine, heavily altered by Octavian's scribes, or a complete, masterful forgery remains one of history's great mysteries. But as Octavian stood before the horrified senators and read the parchment, the effect was devastatingly absolute. The will confirmed all the worst, most terrifying fears of the Roman populace. It lavishly bestowed unimaginable fortunes and Roman territories upon Cleopatra's children, and it legally recognized Caesarion as the true, legitimate blood heir of Julius Caesar. But the most damning, unforgivable clause was Antony's final personal request. Even if he were to die in the city of Rome, he demanded that his body be carried in a magnificent procession through the Forum and shipped across the sea to Alexandria, to be buried eternally beside his Egyptian queen.
The Senate erupted in absolute fury. This was the ultimate betrayal. Antony had definitively chosen a foreign queen and a foreign capital over his own homeland. The senators swiftly voted to violently strip Antony of all his powers, his official titles, and his scheduled consulship. Yet Octavian was brilliantly cautious. He knew that the Roman people, and more importantly, the veteran Roman legions, were utterly exhausted by decades of endless Roman-on-Roman bloodshed. He could not afford to frame this massive conflict as just another civil war. Therefore, in a masterstroke of political framing, he did not declare war on Mark Antony. Standing before the Temple of Bellona in his senatorial robes, performing the ancient sacred rites of a Roman priest, Octavian formally declared war entirely upon a foreign enemy, Queen Cleopatra of Egypt. The Mediterranean world was now violently split perfectly in two. It was the austere, disciplined West against the wealthy, glittering East. Antony and Cleopatra immediately began to assemble a war machine of unprecedented, staggering scale. They gathered their massive forces first at the ancient city of Ephesus and then moved to Athens. The sheer size and wealth of their combined military might was awe-inspiring. Over 100,000 heavily armed infantrymen, 12,000 cavalry, and a colossal fleet of nearly 500 massive warships, many of them towering floating fortresses equipped with heavy artillery, catapults, and reinforced bronze rams, were mobilized for the coming apocalyptic clash. Cleopatra herself contributed an astonishing 200 warships to this armada, fully manned, heavily armed, and funded entirely from the inexhaustible treasury of Egypt. And she did not remain behind in the luxurious safety of Alexandria. She rode alongside Antony, residing in the military camps, participating openly in the supreme councils of war, and personally managing the incredibly complex logistics of feeding, paying, and supplying such a gargantuan multinational army. But her highly visible, commanding presence deeply alienated many of Antony's traditional, conservative Roman officers. They deeply resented taking orders from a foreign woman. Disgusted by Antony's apparent subservience to the queen, several of his most trusted generals, advisors, and allied kings began to quietly slip away in the dead of night, defecting across the sea to join Octavian, carrying with them vital, devastating intelligence about Antony's battle plans. In the early spring of 31 BC, Antony and Cleopatra moved their massive armada to the western coast of Greece, anchoring their ships in the wide, sheltered waters of the Ambracian Gulf, near a small rocky promontory known as Actium. They intended to launch a massive, overwhelming invasion across the Ionian Sea, directly into Italy itself.
but they had tragically underestimated the brilliant, highly aggressive military genius of Octavian's chief admiral, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Before Antony could even finish assembling his invasion force, Agrippa struck with terrifying lightning speed. Agrippa's fast, highly maneuverable fleets swept violently across the Greek coastline, capturing vital naval bases, severing Antony's critical supply lines from Egypt and the Peloponnese, and effectively bottling up the colossal Egyptian-Roman armada inside the narrow, easily defensible confines of the Ambracian Gulf. The hunters had suddenly, disastrously become the hunted. For agonizing, suffocating months through the sweltering heat of the Greek summer, Antony and Cleopatra's massive army was trapped. Unable to break out of the blockade by sea and unwilling to abandon their magnificent fleet to fight a land war, the camp was soon ravaged by a terrifying outbreak of malaria and dysentery. Thousands of rowers, sailors, and seasoned soldiers perished in the stinking, mosquito-infested swamps, leaving many of their massive, towering warships severely undercrewed and practically useless. Morale plummeted into the abyss. Fresh food and clean water became desperately scarce. Desertions escalated from a quiet trickle to a steady, demoralizing flood. As the late summer approached, the situation had become absolutely desperate. Antony and Cleopatra were cornered, their massive, once invincible army slowly rotting from within. They faced an agonizing, impossible choice: surrender to Octavian and face the absolute certainty of public humiliation, being paraded in chains through the streets of Rome before being executed, or risk everything they had left in a final, desperate, apocalyptic naval breakout to save themselves and the vast treasury of Egypt.
By late August of 31 BC, the once magnificent camp of Mark Antony and Queen Cleopatra at Actium had deteriorated into a suffocating, disease-ridden nightmare. The oppressive heat of the Greek summer, combined with rampant dysentery, malaria, and the terrifying daily desertions of allied kings and seasoned Roman officers to Octavian's side, had fundamentally broken the spirit of the massive Eastern army. They were completely surrounded by land and effectively blockaded by sea. To remain in the stagnant, festering swamps of the Ambracian Gulf meant slow, inevitable death by starvation or surrender. A desperate, highly secretive war council was convened in the dim, stifling command tent. Antony's most trusted remaining generals, hardened veterans of countless land battles, vehemently urged him to abandon the massive, cumbersome fleet. They argued passionately that their only chance of survival was to march their remaining infantry, still a formidable force of thousands of heavy Roman legionaries, northward into Macedonia, link up with reinforcements from Syria, and force Octavian into a decisive, open-field battle where Roman discipline would inevitably prevail. But Cleopatra, possessing a brilliant, profoundly strategic mind and controlling the vast majority of the remaining treasury, vehemently disagreed. She understood that a protracted, exhausting land war in the rugged mountains of Greece, cut off entirely from the inexhaustible wealth and grain of Egypt, was a guaranteed suicide mission. She argued with fierce, unyielding logic that their true power lay in their colossal warships and the staggering amount of gold stored safely aboard them. She insisted that they must use the sheer, overwhelming size of their heaviest vessels to violently smash through Octavian's naval blockade, escape the suffocating trap, and sail back across the Mediterranean to the impregnable safety of Alexandria, where they could rebuild, regroup, and prepare for a massive defensive war on their own terms. Antony, physically diminished by illness, emotionally shattered by the betrayals of his oldest friends, and entirely dependent on Cleopatra's financial resources, ultimately sided with the Queen of Egypt. It was a fatal, heavily debated decision that would seal the fate of the entire known world. The plan was not to defeat Octavian's entire navy in a glorious, decisive battle. The plan was a massive, heavily armed breakout. For days, under a veil of intense secrecy, Antony ordered his men to secretly burn the hundreds of smaller, uncrewed transport ships that they could no longer man due to the catastrophic losses from disease. He ruthlessly consolidated his best, most loyal veteran soldiers onto the decks of his largest, most terrifying warships, massive, towering dreadnoughts encased in thick wooden armor and heavy bronze plates, equipped with devastating catapults and giant grappling hooks designed to crush smaller vessels. The sheer scale of these floating fortresses was meant to act as an unstoppable, impenetrable battering ram. And deep within the center of this massive formation, heavily protected by a vanguard of Antony's most loyal ships, sailed the spectacular, glittering squadron of 60 Egyptian warships, commanded personally by Queen Cleopatra. Aboard her flagship, the Antoniad, she carried the massive royal war chest, the staggering combined wealth of the Ptolemaic dynasty and Antony's eastern provinces, the absolute key to their survival and their future ability to wage war. Her explicit orders were not to engage the enemy unless absolutely necessary, but to wait for the critical moment when Antony's heavy ships smashed a hole in the blockade and then immediately run for the open sea toward Egypt. On the morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, the winds finally shifted favorably, blowing steadily outward from the Gulf. The colossal combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra, numbering roughly 230 massive warships, slowly rowed out of the narrow straits of Actium and deployed into a massive, imposing battle line across the open water. The sea was calm. The sun glinted blindingly off the polished bronze rams and the heavy armor of the soldiers. Waiting for them, perfectly arranged in a vast, sweeping crescent formation, was the brilliantly commanded navy of Octavian, led by the tactical genius Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Agrippa's fleet was significantly different. It consisted of nearly 400 smaller, incredibly fast, highly maneuverable ships known as Liburnians. They were not designed for massive head-on collisions. They were designed to swarm, to outflank, and to wear down the larger lumbering vessels of the enemy. For hours, the two massive armadas faced each other in absolute, terrifying silence across the shimmering water. Neither side wanted to make the first, potentially fatal move. Antony desperately needed Agrippa to attack first, hoping to draw the smaller ships into the devastating range of his heavy catapults and massive grappling hooks. But Agrippa, brilliant and endlessly patient, refused to take the bait. He ordered his captains to hold their lines, forcing Antony to break formation and row further out to sea, exposing his vulnerable flanks to the faster, swarming vessels. Finally, around noon, the tension snapped. Antony, realizing he could wait no longer, ordered his massive left wing to aggressively advance. The apocalyptic Battle of Actium had begun. The sea erupted into absolute chaos. Agrippa immediately executed his brilliant pre-planned strategy. As Antony's colossal ships charged forward, the faster, smaller Liburnians rapidly retreated backward, drawing the heavy dreadnoughts further out of their tight formation and into the open sea.
Once the massive line was sufficiently broken and scattered, Agrippa's ships violently turned and attacked from all sides like a swarm of angry hornets. They used their superior speed to swiftly row past the towering sides of Antony's ships, raining down terrifying volleys of heavy javelins, flaming arrows, and massive rocks upon the crowded decks, before rapidly reversing their oars and pulling away before the slower ships could grapple them. When a heavy ship did manage to lock on to a smaller vessel, Agrippa's men would launch small, devastating incendiary devices, pots filled with burning pitch, sulfur, and charcoal, setting the massive wooden structures ablaze. The fighting was incredibly brutal, chaotic, and loud. The screams of burning men, the deafening crash of splintering wood, and the heavy thud of catapult stones echoed across the water. In the midst of this horrific, swirling carnage, a critical, fatal gap suddenly opened in the very center of Antony's increasingly disorganized battle line. Agrippa had brilliantly managed to stretch the enemy formation to its absolute breaking point. From her heavily protected position in the rear, aboard the magnificent Antoniad, Queen Cleopatra, possessing an unparalleled strategic clarity even amidst the chaos of battle, instantly recognized the fleeting opportunity. The trap had been sprung, the hole had been opened, and the path to the open sea and survival was momentarily clear. She did not hesitate. In a move that has been heavily debated by historians for over 2 millennia, often completely misrepresented by Roman propaganda as a sudden, cowardly act of panicked flight, Cleopatra executed the exact, prearranged breakout strategy perfectly. She suddenly hoisted her massive, vibrant purple sails, caught the strong, shifting afternoon wind, and aggressively signaled her 60 pristine, heavily armed Egyptian warships to immediately break through the chaotic, fiery gap in the center of the battle line. They smashed through the burning wreckage and the confused combatants, sailing swiftly and directly toward the safety of the open Mediterranean, taking the massive treasury of Egypt with them. When Mark Antony, heavily engaged on the rapidly collapsing right wing, saw the distinctive purple sails of Cleopatra's flagship breaking away and disappearing toward the horizon, he made a decision that fundamentally destroyed his military reputation and handed the entire known world to Octavian. He completely abandoned his massive, fiercely loyal army, his towering dreadnoughts, and the thousands of men dying for his cause in the burning, chaotic waters of Actium. He hastily transferred from his heavy flagship to a smaller, faster galley, took only a handful of close companions, and desperately rowed after the Queen of Egypt. It was a profound, devastating psychological collapse. The once great Roman general, the conqueror of Philippi, had effectively abandoned his command, his honor, and his entire fleet to follow a foreign queen. The remaining forces at Actium, realizing they had been utterly abandoned by their supreme commander, fought on fiercely for several agonizing hours before finally surrendering the burning, shattered remnants of their fleet to Agrippa. The Battle of Actium was over. The combined forces of the East had been completely, catastrophically annihilated. Octavian was now the undisputed, absolute master of the entire Roman world. Antony and Cleopatra had escaped the battle, but they had definitively lost the war. They sailed back to the glittering, wealthy city of Alexandria, not as triumphant conquerors, but as doomed, desperate fugitives, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the final apocalyptic storm that would destroy them both and bring an end to a 3,000-year-old civilization. The long, agonizing voyage back across the Mediterranean from the catastrophic, burning waters of Actium to the golden shores of Egypt was a journey of absolute, suffocating despair. Aboard the swift, fleeing Egyptian flagship, the Antony, a profound and terrifying silence had descended between the two most powerful people in the East. Mark Antony, the once invincible Roman conqueror, a man whose sheer physical presence and booming charisma had once commanded the absolute loyalty of tens of thousands of hardened legionaries, was now completely broken. He sat isolated at the very prow of the ship, his head buried in his hands, staring blankly into the dark, rolling waves for 3 solid days, utterly refusing to speak to Cleopatra or his remaining officers. The psychological devastation of his sudden, cowardly flight, his catastrophic defeat by a younger, less experienced rival, and the horrific realization that he had definitively abandoned his entire army to be slaughtered or captured by Octavian, had entirely consumed his mind. Cleopatra, however, did not have the luxury of paralyzing despair. She was a sovereign monarch, the Queen of Egypt, and the mother of the King of Kings. She possessed a brilliant, ruthlessly pragmatic mind that immediately began calculating their desperate, dwindling options for survival. As their battered fleet finally sailed past the towering Pharaoh's lighthouse and into the massive, familiar harbor of Alexandria, she understood that she could not afford to project weakness or admit the catastrophic scale of their defeat at Actium. The volatile, deeply political citizens of the glittering capital would riot instantly if they sensed that the invincible Roman protection of their queen had vanished. In a masterstroke of desperate, highly calculated political theater, Cleopatra ordered her remaining ships to enter the harbor with their prows proudly adorned with victory garlands, their musicians playing triumphant, echoing melodies of conquest, as if they had just returned from a spectacular, world-altering victory over Octavian. She marched confidently into the royal palace, immediately suppressing any initial rumors of disaster. But beneath the facade of absolute confidence, she was rapidly and ruthlessly securing her position. She swiftly ordered the execution of several powerful, wealthy Alexandrian nobles whom she suspected of disloyalty, or who might secretly attempt to negotiate with Octavian's approaching forces, confiscating their vast fortunes to desperately refill her depleted war chests. For nearly a year, an eerie, suffocating twilight settled over the city of Alexandria. Octavian, methodical, cold, and entirely secure in his absolute victory, did not immediately pursue Antony and Cleopatra to Egypt. He spent the winter carefully solidifying his total control over the restless Roman provinces, integrating Antony's surrendered legions into his own massive army, and meticulously preparing the final, overwhelming invasion force that would permanently crush the last remnants of Ptolemaic resistance and seize the staggering, almost unimaginable wealth of the Egyptian treasury. During this agonizing period of waiting, Antony remained largely isolated, plunging deeper into a severe, paralyzing melancholy. He abandoned the opulent royal palace, building a small, secluded dwelling on a narrow strip of land jutting out into the great harbor, which he bitterly called the Timonium, after the famous misanthrope Timon of Athens. He declared to his few remaining friends that he was done with humanity, done with the treacherous world of politics, and ready to embrace the quiet oblivion of defeat. But Cleopatra refused to surrender to despair. She launched a frantic, astonishingly ambitious, and ultimately doomed plan to save her dynasty and her children. Recognizing that the Mediterranean was now entirely controlled by Octavian's invincible, swarming fleets, she ordered the construction of a massive secret fleet of ships on the shores of the Red Sea. Her desperate strategy was to quietly load her entire royal treasury, her family, and her most loyal followers onto these vessels, sail out of the Red Sea, across the vast Indian Ocean, and establish a new, powerful empire in India, far beyond the terrifying reach of Rome. However, her brilliant plan was violently thwarted before it could even begin. The fiercely independent Arab tribes of Petra, the Nabateans, acting under the direct influence of Octavian's agents, or perhaps seeking to loot the incredible wealth of the Ptolemies, suddenly swept out of the desert and viciously burned Cleopatra's newly built fleet as it sat helpless in the dry docks. The route to the east was definitively closed. She was completely, inescapably trapped in Alexandria. As the summer of 30 BC approached, the inevitable finally arrived. Octavian's massive, highly disciplined legions marched inexorably eastward across the harsh Sinai desert from Syria, while another powerful Roman army attacked simultaneously from the west, marching out of the recently conquered province of Cyrenaica, modern-day Libya. The pincer movement was devastating, slow, and absolutely terrifying. The remaining garrisons of the Egyptian army, realizing the sheer, overwhelming hopelessness of their situation, began to surrender or defect to Octavian without firing a single arrow. The enemy was literally at the golden gates of Alexandria. Antony, briefly roused from his deep depression by the immediate, visceral threat of combat and the desperate urge to die a glorious Roman death, suddenly mobilized his remaining, fiercely loyal cavalry and launched a surprisingly fierce, brilliantly executed counterattack outside the city walls. He managed to temporarily scatter Octavian's advance guard, returning to the palace covered in dust and blood, demanding a passionate kiss from Cleopatra in his armor, declaring a hollow, fleeting victory. But it was merely the last desperate gasp of a dying lion. The very next morning, Antony rode out again, fully expecting to lead a massive, coordinated assault by his remaining navy and infantry against Octavian's massive camp. Instead, he witnessed an apocalyptic betrayal. As he watched from a slight rise overlooking the harbor, his entire Egyptian fleet, completely intact and heavily armed, sailed out to meet Octavian's ships. They did not attack. They suddenly raised their oars in a silent, perfectly synchronized gesture of total surrender and joined the enemy without striking a single blow. Moments later, his remaining cavalry abruptly deserted, galloping over to Octavian's lines. He was completely alone. Believing that Cleopatra had secretly betrayed him to Octavian to save herself and her kingdom, a tragically plausible assumption in the ruthless, murderous world of the Ptolemies, Antony returned to the palace in a blind, agonizing rage. He bellowed that the queen had finally handed him over to his greatest enemy. Cleopatra, terrified of his violent fury and realizing that the absolute end was finally upon them, fled the palace with her two most trusted handmaidens, Iris and Charmian. She took refuge inside a massive, heavily fortified and recently constructed mausoleum, a towering stone monument adjacent to the Temple of Isis, where she had secretly amassed a staggering, unimaginable hoard of gold, silver, pearls, ivory, ebony, and highly flammable materials. She ordered the massive, impenetrable bronze doors of the tomb to be permanently sealed from the inside, dropping heavy stone blocks to ensure they could never be opened by force. And then, in a desperate, highly calculated move that would seal the tragic fate of Mark Antony, she ordered a frantic messenger to seek him out and deliver a final, devastating lie. The messenger rushed to Antony, finding him broken and despondent, and announced that Queen Cleopatra, unwilling to face the humiliation of captivity, had already taken her own life inside her tomb. The news shattered Antony entirely. His rage instantly evaporated, replaced by a profound, agonizing grief and a sudden clarifying resolution. He had lost his honor, his army, his reputation, and now, he believed, he had lost the only woman he had ever truly loved, the brilliant partner who had defined his existence for the last decade. He turned to his most loyal, trusted servant, a man named Eros, and gave him a terrible final command. "Draw your sword and strike me down. I command you to end this disgrace." But Eros, deeply devoted to his master, could not bear to kill the great Roman general. He drew his blade, but instead of striking Antony, he violently plunged the sword into his own chest, collapsing dead at Antony's feet. Moved by the incredible, ultimate loyalty of his servant, Antony drew his own heavy Roman gladius. "Eros," he whispered, "you have taught me what I must do." He raised the blade, angled it upward below his ribs, and forcefully thrust it deep into his own abdomen. The blow was devastating, slicing through his organs, but it was incredibly, agonizingly, not immediately fatal. He collapsed onto his couch, bleeding profusely, crying out for his remaining attendants to quickly finish him off, to end the blinding pain and the unbearable humiliation of his failure. But his men, terrified by the sight of the dying conqueror and fearing the wrath of Octavian, fled the room, leaving Mark Antony alone to slowly bleed to death in the silent, opulent halls of the conquered palace.
The agonizing silence of the Alexandrian palace was broken only by the ragged, labored breathing of Mark Antony as he lay bleeding heavily onto the opulent, blood-soaked cushions of his couch. The fatal, self-inflicted wound to his abdomen was excruciating, a slow, terrifyingly inevitable descent into oblivion. His closest attendants had fled in sheer terror, leaving the once invincible master of the Roman East completely abandoned in his final, desperate hours. He writhed in the dim light, repeatedly begging the few terrified servants who dared to approach the doorway to take his gladius and deliver the final, merciful blow. No one moved. The fear of Octavian's impending, violent retribution hung over the palace like a suffocating shroud. Suddenly, a frantic commotion erupted in the corridor outside his chamber. A breathless messenger, dispatched in absolute panic from the heavily fortified mausoleum of the queen, burst into the room. He took one horrified look at the dying Roman general, dropped to his knees in the slick blood, and delivered the devastating truth. Cleopatra was not dead. She was alive, securely locked inside her impenetrable tomb, alongside her staggering wealth, and she desperately implored Antony to be brought to her before he perished. The realization that his violent, impulsive act of suicide had been entirely based on a tragic, highly calculated falsehood must have hit Antony with the force of a physical blow. Yet in that agonizing moment, the fierce, consuming passion that had bound him to the Egyptian queen for over a decade surged through his fading consciousness. He summoned the very last reserves of his legendary strength. He commanded his terrified servants and his personal bodyguards to physically lift his massive, bleeding frame and carry him through the chaotic, crumbling streets of Alexandria to the towering stone monument of Isis where Cleopatra was entombed. The journey through the city was a grim, macabre procession. The once glorious capital of the Ptolemies was rapidly descending into panic and lawlessness as Octavian's massive, highly disciplined legions systematically breached the outer defenses and began to occupy the wealthy districts. When Antony's men finally reached the base of Cleopatra's imposing, windowless mausoleum, they were met with a terrifying obstacle. The queen, fiercely determined not to be taken alive by Octavian's soldiers and paraded as a subjugated captive in a Roman triumph, flatly refused to order the massive, sealed bronze doors to be opened. She suspected a Roman trick, a desperate ploy by Octavian's advance guard to capture her alive and seize the staggering, heavily guarded treasury she had stockpiled inside. Instead of opening the doors, Cleopatra and her two fiercely loyal, terrified handmaidens, Iris and Charmion, appeared high above the ground at a small, heavily barred window near the top of the monumental structure. Looking down, Cleopatra witnessed the horrific, devastating sight of her lover, the great Mark Antony, covered in blood, his life rapidly ebbing away on a stretcher at the base of the tomb. She let out a piercing, agonizing cry of profound grief, violently tearing her royal garments and violently beating her chest in traditional Egyptian mourning. In a scene of almost unimaginable physical exertion and absolute desperation, Cleopatra ordered ropes and heavy canvas bands to be lowered from the high window. Antony's men securely tied the dying general to the thick ropes. Then the Queen of Egypt, a woman who had spent her entire life surrounded by unimaginable luxury and absolute power, personally strained with all her physical might, alongside her two fiercely loyal, terrified handmaidens, Iris and Charmion, to haul the heavy, bleeding body of Mark Antony up the sheer stone face of the monument. The ancient historian Plutarch famously described this agonizing, deeply moving spectacle. The people of Alexandria, watching from below in absolute, terrified silence, witnessed the queen's face contorted with violent effort, her arms shaking as she desperately pulled the ropes inch by agonizing inch, while Antony, slipping in and out of consciousness, weakly reached out his blood-soaked hands toward her. Finally, they managed to drag his heavy, limp body through the narrow window and collapse onto the cold stone floor of the tomb. Cleopatra violently tore her remaining clothes, using the expensive fabric to desperately staunch the massive, fatal wound in his abdomen. She wept uncontrollably, covering his pale face with blood-stained kisses, calling him her lord, her husband, and her emperor. She seemed to entirely forget her own desperate, deeply perilous situation in the face of his agonizing, inevitable death. But Mark Antony, even in his final moments, remained a pragmatic Roman commander. He gently urged her to stop crying and instead demanded a cup of strong, undiluted wine to ease his excruciating pain. After drinking, he spoke his final haunting words to the queen. He urged her not to pity him for his sudden tragic downfall, but to remember the staggering heights of power and glory they had achieved together. He advised her to boldly seek a political settlement with Octavian, if she could do so without sacrificing her honor or her kingdom. But he specifically warned her to trust only one man among Octavian's ruthless advisors, a senator named Gaius Proculeius. With those final, desperate instructions, Mark Antony, the man who had nearly ruled the entire known world, died in the arms of Cleopatra. Shortly after Antony's last breath left his body, the terrifying, inevitable reality of her situation violently crashed down upon Cleopatra.
The heavy, rhythmic thud of Roman military boots echoed outside the thick walls of her tomb. Octavian's heavily armed soldiers had arrived, effectively surrounding the monument. But Octavian, calculating, cold, and entirely focused on the monumental prize of Egypt, did not want Cleopatra dead, not yet. He desperately needed her alive. He needed to capture her and her staggering, unimaginable wealth intact, to fully fund his massive, restless armies, and to completely pay off his enormous political debts in Rome. Most importantly, he needed the ultimate crowning spectacle for his impending triumph. He intended to parade the legendary exotic Queen of Egypt, the woman who had defied the greatest generals of Rome, in heavy golden chains through the crowded, roaring streets of the capital, a living testament to his absolute, terrifying victory over the corrupted East. If Cleopatra were to suddenly die inside her impenetrable tomb, or worse, if she carried out her deeply terrifying threat to ignite the massive hoard of gold, silver, pearls, and highly flammable materials she had stockpiled alongside her, Octavian's spectacular victory would be entirely hollow. The staggering wealth of the Ptolemies would be reduced to a useless melted puddle of slag, and the ultimate prize of his brutal, decade-long civil war would be violently snatched from his grasp at the very last moment. Octavian dispatched his trusted, highly capable general, Gaius Cornelius Gallus, to the base of the mausoleum to engage the queen in immediate, desperate negotiations. The plan was a brilliant, highly deceptive stall tactic. While Gallus stood outside the massive bronze doors, loudly speaking to Cleopatra through a small opening, offering generous, entirely false promises of leniency and protection for her children, he deliberately commanded her total attention. Simultaneously, the man Antony had explicitly warned her to trust, Gaius Proculaeus, quietly, swiftly led a small, heavily armed strike team of specialized Roman soldiers to the back of the monument. They quickly scaled the sheer stone wall using ladders, violently smashed through the very same high window that Cleopatra had used to haul up the dying Antony just hours earlier, and rapidly descended the stairs into the central chamber of the tomb. Cleopatra, deeply engaged in the tense, high-stakes negotiations with Gallus, suddenly heard the terrifying clatter of heavy armor and the rapid thud of Roman boots behind her. She turned violently and saw Proculaeus and his men charging into the room. Realizing instantly that she had been completely outmaneuvered and captured, she did not hesitate. In a sudden, desperate movement, she snatched a small, highly decorated dagger from her belt and raised it to plunge the blade deep into her own chest. But she was too slow. Proculaeus, anticipating her absolute terrifying determination to die, violently lunged forward, grabbed her arms, and forcefully wrestled the dagger from her grasp. He physically restrained the queen, violently shaking her garments to ensure she had not hidden any deadly, fast-acting poisons in the folds of her dress. The ultimate nightmare had materialized. The brilliant, fiercely independent Queen of Egypt, the living goddess Isis, had finally been taken alive by the conquering legions of Rome. She was now a deeply prized, heavily guarded captive in her own magnificent conquered capital.
Captured and confined within the opulent, echoing walls of her own royal palace, Queen Cleopatra was now a prisoner of the Roman machine she had so brilliantly navigated for more than 2 decades. The heavily armed guards of Octavian stood outside her gilded doors, their silent presence a constant, suffocating reminder that the 3,000-year-old independence of Egypt was rapidly drawing to a close. Yet even in absolute defeat, Cleopatra's mind remained razor-sharp. She knew Octavian.
She understood that beneath his calm, calculating exterior lay a ruthless ambition that mirrored her own, but devoid of the passion that had ultimately destroyed Mark Antony. A few days after her capture, the chilling, highly anticipated meeting between the last queen of Egypt and the future first emperor of Rome finally took place. Octavian entered her chambers not as an equal sovereign, but as a cold, victorious conqueror inspecting his most valuable prize. Cleopatra, physically weakened by grief, fever, and a desperate self-inflicted starvation strike she had briefly attempted, threw herself at his feet. She wept. She presented him with the letters of Julius Caesar to prove her long-standing loyalty to his adoptive father, and she begged for the lives and the future of her children. Octavian listened quietly, his face an unreadable mask of Roman stoicism. He spoke softly, offering her vague reassurances, promising that she would not be harmed and that her children would be treated with the dignity befitting their royal blood. But Cleopatra, a master of political theater and human psychology, saw right through his hollow, polite words. She recognized the terrifying truth hidden in his cold, calculating eyes. He had absolutely no intention of leaving her in Egypt, and he certainly had no intention of allowing her to live out her days in peaceful exile. She was the ultimate trophy. She was to be heavily chained in gold and paraded through the roaring, bloodthirsty streets of Rome, a spectacular, humiliated spectacle to crown his ultimate triumph. And her beloved son, Caesarion, the true biological heir of Julius Caesar, was a living, breathing threat that Octavian's regime could never allow to survive. Her worst fears were soon confirmed by a young, sympathetic Roman aristocrat named Cornelius Dolabella, who had been deeply moved by the queen's tragic majesty. In absolute secrecy, he whispered the devastating intelligence to Cleopatra. Within 3 days, Octavian planned to forcefully transport her and her remaining children across the sea to Italy. Furthermore, the order had already been quietly given to hunt down and execute young Caesarion. Too many Caesars, Octavian had chillingly declared, is not a good thing. For Cleopatra, the path was suddenly crystal clear. She would never allow herself to be reduced to a chained captive, dragged behind the chariot of the man who had destroyed her family and her empire. She would not be mocked by the Roman mobs. She was a Ptolemy. She was the living goddess Isis. She would dictate the terms of her own departure from the world, securing her eternal dignity and denying Octavian his ultimate crowning glory. With meticulous, quiet precision, she began to prepare. She requested, and was surprisingly granted, permission to visit the tomb of Mark Antony one last time. There, pouring sweet-smelling libations over his grave and crowning his resting place with magnificent lotus flowers, she whispered her final farewell, promising that they would soon be reunited in the afterlife. Returning to her chambers, she ordered a grand, luxurious final meal to be prepared. She bathed, allowing her handmaidens to anoint her body with the finest, most fragrant essential oils, and dressed herself in her most magnificent, sweeping royal robes, adorning her head with the golden diadem of the pharaohs. She was preparing not for death, but for a divine transition. Following the lavish meal, a humble peasant arrived at the heavy palace doors, carrying a simple woven wicker basket. When the Roman guards inspected it, they saw only a large pile of sweet, ripe, heavy figs hidden beneath the broad green leaves. Satisfied that it was merely a harmless gift for the captive queen, they allowed the peasant to pass. but hidden deep within the dark, sweet-smelling depths of the basket, coiled beneath the fruit, was the instrument of her salvation. According to the most enduring legendary accounts of history, it was an asp, a venomous Egyptian cobra, the ancient sacred symbol of divine royalty that adorned the crown of the pharaohs. Other historians quietly suggest she may have used a lethal, fast-acting poison concealed within a hollow hairpin. The exact method remains a magnificent, eternal mystery, but the result was undeniable. Cleopatra dismissed everyone from her chambers, keeping only her two most fiercely loyal handmaidens, Iris and Charmian, by her side. She wrote a final, beautifully composed letter to Octavian, requesting only one thing, that she be buried beside Mark Antony. Then she reached into the basket of figs. When Octavian received her letter moments later, he realized instantly what she had done. Panic gripped the Roman conqueror. He violently dispatched his fastest guards to her chambers, desperate to keep his greatest prize alive. They smashed through the heavy doors, but the silence inside was absolute and heavy. There, resting upon a magnificent golden couch, completely untouched by violence or the indignity of a Roman triumph, lay Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. She was 39 years old. She was dressed in her full, glittering royal regalia, her face utterly peaceful, looking as though she had simply fallen into a deep, beautiful sleep. At her feet lay her faithful handmaiden Iris, already dead, and standing by the queen's head was Charmian, swaying weakly from the deadly venom, using her final fading breath to lovingly straighten the golden diadem upon Cleopatra's brow. "Is this well done, Charmian?" one of the furious Roman guards shouted as he burst into the room. "Extremely well," Charmian whispered as she collapsed to the marble floor, "as befits the descendant of so many kings." Octavian was furious, deeply frustrated that he had been entirely outmaneuvered by the queen one final time. Yet even he could not help but feel a profound, begrudging admiration for her magnificent, defiant end. Honoring her final request, he ordered that she be buried with full, spectacular royal honors alongside Mark Antony, their bodies resting together for eternity beneath the golden sands of Alexandria. With the death of Cleopatra on August 12, 30 BC, an incomprehensibly vast chapter of human history quietly closed. The Ptolemaic dynasty was extinguished. The independent kingdom of Egypt, a magnificent golden civilization that had stood for 3,000 years, was instantly reduced to a mere province of the Roman Empire, its staggering wealth used to build the imperial foundations of Octavian, who would soon become Caesar Augustus. But Cleopatra's legacy proved to be entirely immortal. The Roman propaganda machine tried desperately to reduce her to a mere seductress, a footnote in the lives of great men. But history remembers the truth. She was a brilliant scholar, a master linguist, a naval commander, and a profoundly capable ruler who held the greatest military power on earth at bay for more than 20 decades, using only her intellect, her wealth, and her undeniable majesty. And so, as the image of the Golden Queen fades into the shadowy mists of antiquity, let the heavy, turbulent history of Rome and Egypt drift away from your mind. Imagine the soft, rhythmic lapping of the dark waters against the ancient stones of Alexandria. Feel the cool, dry breeze of the desert night sweeping across the endless dunes. The great pharaohs are sleeping. The empires have turned to dust. The ancient world is finally at peace. Let your breathing slow, matching the gentle, eternal flow of the mighty Nile. Sink deeper into the quiet darkness. Let go of the waking world, and allow the whispering sands of time to carry you away into a deep, restful, and dreamless sleep.